The night was heavy with silence, yet the desert seemed to hum a melody known only to hearts that have loved too deeply to forget. Love, in its most divine disguise, dressed itself in sand and starlight, choosing the dunes of Dubai as its sacred altar. Under that golden moon, Sheikh Hamdan stood not as a prince, but as a man who had surrendered his soul to something beyond the grasp of crowns or command. The wind carried her name through the endless dunes, and he could almost hear her laughter, soft, rebellious, unafraid, echoing through eternity like a promise never written but always felt. He had written verses in the stillness of the palace corridors, verses that glowed with the ink of remembrance. They were not for the world to see, for the world would never understand that a royal's heart could ache for a love so human, so fragile, so infinite. His pen bled devotion, his breath whispered poetry, and every word carried the dust of her memory. Even the marble halls that mirrored his footsteps had learned to hold their breath whenever her name crossed his thoughts. For in that name lay the secret of his unspoken chapters, the love story that the crown could not control. She came into his life like the first sunrise after endless night, barefoot in soul, wrapped in serenity. She didn't bow to his title. Instead, she met his eyes as though she was reading the man beneath the prince. It was this courage, this purity, that undid him. He fell, not because he chose to, but because his destiny had already been written in her silence. Every glance, every breath, every shared sunset became scripture, the holy verses of a love too sacred for the eyes of the ordinary. The palace guards saw him walk through the gardens alone, his gaze lost between constellations. They whispered that the prince had changed. What they didn't know was that he was walking through invisible memories, seeing her footprints in the sand, hearing her voice in the rustle of palm trees. Love had rewritten his world. It no longer revolved around kingdoms or power, but around the scent of her existence that refused to fade. Even time, in all its arrogance, bowed before the eternity that existed between them. In the secrecy of night, he would write letters addressed to no one and everyone. The words danced with longing. You are not gone. You are just hidden in the folds of my faith. Those letters remained tucked away in books no one dared to open, because within them lived a truth too fragile to expose, that the mightiest prince had once knelt before the altar of love and called it his salvation. She had touched his life not with grandeur but with gentleness, the kind that lingers even after it's gone. Her love was not a storm. It was the quiet after rain, the hush before dawn, the peace that made his chaos meaningful. And even after she left, her presence lived within him like a lantern that refused to dim, glowing with the same warmth that once turned his heart to gold. He often wondered if love could ever die, or if it merely changed its shape, waiting for another lifetime to bloom again. Sometimes he would stand on the royal balcony, looking at the vastness of his city, the towers, the lights, the sea, yet none of it could fill the emptiness she left behind. For all his power, he was powerless against the ghost of what they once were. Love, he realized, doesn't end with distance or silence. It continues, breathing through the stars, whispering through the wind. And every night, as the moon climbed above the desert, he felt her beside him, unseen but undeniable. There were days when the kingdom celebrated him, when the world called him a poet prince. Yet behind every line he wrote was her shadow, delicate, divine, and infinite. His poems were no longer about victory or valor. They were confessions disguised as verses, prayers woven into rhythm. He wrote not to be admired, but to keep her alive, to ensure that love, dressed in sand and starlight, would never be forgotten by time's unkind hands. She had once told him that real love doesn't ask to be witnessed, it only asks to be true. And he carried that truth like an heirloom, wearing it under his smile, beneath his robes, inside his heart. Even in her absence, she ruled him, not through command, but through memory. The world saw a prince crowned by destiny, but only he knew he was truly crowned by love. The desert, his silent companion, remembered everything.
The desert below shimmered like an ocean of gold beneath the moonlight. He could almost see her walking there, her silhouette painted by memory. The image was both a comfort and a curse, for every time he saw her in his mind, he was reminded of the distance between dreams and destiny. Yet, even in that ache, there was beauty. Because to love her was to live poetry, and poetry, he believed, was the closest thing a man could have to heaven. He took a deep breath, letting the wind carry his confession into the night. If love has a scent, he whispered, it would be the air you left behind. His words melted into the horizon, soft but eternal. Somewhere in the darkness, a shooting star blazed across the sky, a silent promise that even the universe heard him. For love, when pure, leaves ripples that touch every corner of creation. The call to prayer echoed faintly in the distance, grounding him back into the world of duty and dawn. Yet his soul lingered in the stars, unwilling to return. He turned his gaze one last time toward the moon, his heart both heavy and alive. Tell her, he murmured softly, that I still write for her. Tell her that my heart never moved on, it only learned to wait quietly beneath the sky. The moon said nothing, but its light seemed to glow brighter, as if carrying his message across the desert. And in that moment, Sheikh Hamdan smiled faintly, not as a prince who lost, but as a poet who loved completely. The world would never know the depth of that night, but he would remember it for the rest of his days. The night when the moon became his messenger, the stars his witnesses, and her name.
He whispered one evening, and now the world reads my scars as scripture. A shooting star blazed across the sky just then, his answer, his affirmation. The universe itself seemed to echo her love back to him. When his final twilight arrived, Fazza sat facing the horizon, the same place where she once stood beside him. The wind carried the scent of jasmine again, warm and familiar. As the sun descended, it bathed the desert in pure gold, as if honoring their eternal connection. He closed his eyes and smiled, his heart at peace. For he knew that love like theirs never truly ends. It merely changes its form, from touch to memory, from poetry to light. And as the last rays kissed the sand, the prince who learned